Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. You join us at a really delicate time as well, where our representative is negotiating a truce between a rival podcast. Let's go over and see how it's going.
I know there is much we can learn from each other if we can negotiate a truce. We can find a way to coexist. Can there be a peace between us?
No peace.
Worth a try.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, given away in the title, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients really that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of the effort, the work, the heft that goes into making a film. And that is enough preamble, because I'm going to get on with the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Let's go back to the 1990s to what became an iconic blockbuster movie. Here's a clip from the trailer. The story's coming. The other side of this.
Sir, I think you should listen to this.
This better not be another damn Russian spy job.
Boy from air traffic road say the skies are clear.
It's the real thing. A radio signal from another world.
Mr. President, our intelligence tells us the object is settled into a stationary orbit. Part of it is broken off into nearly 36 other pieces, smaller than the whole, sir. Yet over 15 miles in width themselves.
Where are they heading?
They should be entering our atmosphere within the next 25 minutes.
Crikey, that was a clip from 1996's Independence Day, directed by Roland Emmerich, written by Emmerich and Dean Devlin, and starring Will Smith, Bill Pullman, Jeff Goldblum, Mary McDonnell, Judd Hirsch, Margaret Collin, Randy Quaid, Robert Loggia, James Redhorn, Harvey Fierstein. I mean, pretty much everyone seemed to be in it by the time filming had finished. But the story of Independence Day goes back to the previous collaboration between Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich, and that would be the movie Stargate. Now, Stargate was a surprise hit. It was made for the independent production company Carolco. It was famous at the time for giving Kurt Russell a $7 million payday at a point where his box office prowess didn't seem to justify that. But Stargate turned into an international hit and also would spawn several TV series. And I will come to the story of Stargate in a future episode. But it was in October 1994, while doing press for the film, that the idea really came into frame for what became Independence Day. That writer-producer Dean Devlin and director Roland Emmerich were on the press tour for Stargate, and Emmerich recalled being asked by a reporter if he believed in aliens, and they said, well, no, didn't really. But then the question came up, what if tomorrow morning we woke up and spaceships were hovering over the 30 biggest cities on Earth? The following morning, the idea was clicking into place, and Emmerich and Devlin had their next project. Or, if you believe the version that Emmerich and Devlin then told the Hollywood Reporter 25 years later in an article, Warner Brothers was trying to lure them to do a prison escape movie with Harrison Ford for a price of a $70 million prison escape movie at that as well. Now, by the way the times work, this would have been after Harrison Ford had done The Fugitive, which was, last time I checked, something of a prison escape movie, albeit without a prison. However, Emmerich reflected that if he had that level of money, he could do something he really wanted to do, which was an alien invasion film. And so he headed off to a bookshop, bought a copy of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, and he read it and decided I wanted to do a modern version of that. However, the story of the press junket, whichever version of the history of Independence Day you go with, remains at the heart of it. And in an interview that Emmerich and Devlin gave, they did describe how they were doing this press junket. The reporter asked, "Do you really believe that aliens built pyramids?" We said no. And as Devlin said, Roland interrupted me and basically came up with this idea of the 14-mile wide spaceships covering the sky. And he leaned over to me and said, "I think I have our next movie." Now, the problem was they may have had their idea for their next movie, but this was the era where competing projects seemed to spring up quite a lot. And in this case, there was another alien invasion film coming from a major Hollywood studio, this time Warner Brothers, which was progressing the film Mars Attacks to be directed by Tim Burton, which was gathering steam. And so Emmerich called up a friend of his, a contact who worked at Warner Brothers, and they basically told him that Mars Attacks was currently on schedule for an August 1996 release. Now, this is towards the end of 1994. Emmerich told Devlin, "We've got to drop everything and get writing." They knew if they were going to do an alien invasion film, it had to be on the big screen first. So what they did is they rented a house. They went to Mexico for a few weeks, the two of them, and while there they watched a lot of 70s disaster movies. That was more of a touch point than the kind of 50s sci-fi you might think when you watch Independence Day. And in one room you'd have Emmerich doing storyboards for the film. In the other they'd have Devlin who was beavering away on the script. They would keep chatting over ideas, they would go through reference materials, but this was a fast-track way to write a summer blockbuster film. And it worked. 3.5 weeks after they walked into their house in Mexico, they had their foundation. They had a script and they could put it out to auction. Now, there was no shortage of bids. This was a big special effects science fiction movie. It was written in the aftermath of the release of films such as Jurassic Park, showing just how fast visual effects were moving in the 1990s. There was a film called Twister going through the Hollywood system at this point as well. And so the bids came in, but it was Universal and 20th Century Fox who were the final bidders for the project. And in the end, they went with 20th Century Fox because conditionally, they agreed to give Roland Emmerich final cut of the movie. The pair would get $7.5 million for their work, plus a share of the profits. But Fox went into this also knowing that it was going to be an expensive film, albeit not at the level of the most expensive films being made around this time. So True Lies had become, in 1994, for instance, the first movie to cost more than $100 million to make. The story originally was Terminator 2 Judgment Day, but over time the price of that has come down to the high 90 millions. But still, we were at the point where True Lies was costing 9 figures. Waterworld in 1995 would cost about $170 million to make. The budget for Independence Day was being pegged around the $70 million mark, and that meant that there was a lot of money for visual effects as long as they didn't spend it on stars. But that was no matter either, because Jurassic Park hadn't had stars, and what 20th Century Fox was savvy to was the visual effects were going to be the universal selling point. In much the same way that a Fast and Furious film can sell the international language of car chases, here was big spaceships, and Fox figured that's going to play potentially bigger around the world than just a straight movie star movie. But still, the casting was important because one of the things that come out of those 70s disaster movies is the huge ensemble that they tended to attract. And so they had to cast the leads for a start. I mean, Jeff Goldblum, very wisely, he was in mind fairly early on and signed on the dotted line. But for the other lead role, it was Ethan Hawke was an early option, but he was rejected at this point as being too young. And so it was Will Smith's name that ultimately got mentioned. But it's worth noting, at the point these conversations were taking place in 1994, Will Smith was not a movie star. He'd certainly done a movie or two. He popped up in the film 6 Degrees of Separation and he Made in America in 1993. But it was still The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the TV show, that most people knew Will Smith for. Could he translate that appeal to become an international box office star? Well, the test was going to be a 1995 movie called Bad Boys. But again, at the point these conversations were taking place, Bad Boys wasn't out. Will Smith was an unknown quantity at the box office and was a huge, huge gamble. Now, Fox had retained some degree of casting control as part of the deal it had signed with Devlin and Emmerich, and wasn't happy with the idea of Will Smith taking the lead. But it was Emmerich who went to bat for him, and it got to the point where it was just weeks to go before shooting and the casting wasn't locked down, and Emmerich pulled what really turned out to be the trump card. He threatened to stop the movie with 20th Century Fox and take it to Universal, who would have retained interest. Now, it was a bluff of sorts. I mean, contracts had been signed at this point, and so were Emmerich and Devlin to up sticks and go elsewhere, there would have been a lot of legalities. But Fox decided to bite the proverbial bullet and agreed the casting of Will Smith, and thus the rest of the ensemble could fall into place. Now, most of it fairly logically fell into place as well. They looked far and wide to find the people to flesh out that Independence Day cast, and it is a deep, long, interesting cast as well. I mean, Vivacia A. Fox, for instance, she got a break in this particular film. Harry Connick Jr. turns up as well. I mean, Brent Spiner from Star Trek, he's in there. Adam Baldwin. So you go down the list, and there are good actors right the way down. But for the role of the president, the president role in Independence Day is now pretty iconic. Bill Pullman giving the Independence Day speech. But the original way that the president character was written was far more villainous than the one that we got. And so the name that was thrown into the mix was Kevin Spacey. Different times, right? But Kevin Spacey was his agents were after $200,000 for him to star in this. Again, Kevin Spacey, and this was before the scandals that have enveloped Kevin Spacey's life. It was also before he became, again, a box office and critical draw on the big screen in his own right. He'd just done this film called The Usual Suspects, but it hadn't really gone out, and no one knew how it would land. And as much as the filmmakers tried to persuade Fox to hand over $200,000, they refused to do so. Spacey would win the Oscar that year for The Usual Suspects. His price would shoot into seven figures. But him turning the role down, or more to the point, them not being able to agree a price for Spacey to take part in Independence Day, opened the door for Bill Pullman, and opened the door for a rewrite of that character as well to make him a lot more heroic. Now, the story of Independence Day, by the time it was released, was heavily dominated by the visual effects work on the film. However, this was not a film that was entirely reliant on computers for its visuals. It was made at a point where physical and computer effects were still intersecting a little bit. You see it in Twister, released around the same time. Jurassic Park, often held up, as I've mentioned it before, as kind of the yardstick, actually doesn't have an awful lot in terms of screen time of computer-generated effects. There's a lot of physical trickery in that as well. And what it meant in the case of Independence Day was an awful lot of prep, and an awful lot of physical preparation as part of that was required. Because this was now something of a race, that they knew they had to get the film done before Mars Attacks came out, but also Fox had only given this the green light at the end of 1994. And so in the early stages of 1995, well, the preparation was underway in earnest. And so sets were being built at an old airplane hangar, for instance. And I mean, sets were also repurposed from other films. They called in the stealth bomber set from the film Broken Arrow, for instance. An interior set from the film Crimson Tide. That was redressed as well and reused in Independence Day. One shortcut that would have been useful is if they got support off the American military. But at first, it looked like that's exactly what they were going to get. I mean, there were supplies on offer. There were planes on offer for the production. All it had to do was to get through a script check that the military insisted on. And the problem here was that Dean Devlin's screenplay for Independence Day, or Devlin and Emmerich's, makes extensive references to Area 51, the mysterious part of the American landscape, which, depending which theory you believe, is either chock full of aliens or has nothing in it whatsoever. But either way, it is very secretive, and the military protect it. And the military wanted all references to Area 51 removed from the Independence Day script as condition of lending those supplies and condition of lending those planes. planes as well. And so, this was just a red line for the filmmakers. They just said no. And what this meant was they had to kind of rescale and rebuild a little bit. They relied on a lot of ingenuity when it came to filming, because they were now down to one fully working full-size jet, for instance, when ideally they needed more. And so it was a case of they were ordering in even more model work just to try and fill in some of the gaps. And there was a lot of models being built already for the film. Against the backdrop of the preparation for the movie as well, the script was all but done, but Fox wasn't keen on the title of it. Independence Day. Now, Independence Day was also a title registered at Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers would have to agree to release it, or a deal would need to be struck there. But and this would carry on throughout the production as well. There was still some pushback, but Dean Devlin had a bit of a brainwave that ultimately cemented the choice of name. And he basically would say he went into a room and in 5 minutes he whipped the speech out. And the speech that Independence Day is heavily known for. Bill Pullman, today we celebrate our Independence Day. And he just said, we didn't even read it. It was just a placeholder. But what they were doing was writing in the title into the film, because they knew that would make it harder to change. Devlin had also said to Emmerich that he wanted a kind of St. Crispin's Day speech. And so it ticked that box as well, the bit where the king is rallying the troops. But for a script that hadn't been really rewritten an awful lot once they'd emerged from their Mexican hideout, there were these little tweaks that were just being made to it just to tick one or two of the things that Devlin and Emmerich were particularly keen on. Now, the complex preparation was done in time for filming to start on July the 28th, 1995, less than a year before the movie was in cinemas. Now, visual effects, computer-generated visual effects, was still, as groundbreaking as the 90s were for them, they were still difficult, they were still time-intensive. I mean, Toy Story was being rendered around this time, and each individual frame of Toy Story was taking an awful amount of computer power just to render one frame, and even then it wasn't happening instantly. And so a couple of things were needing to happen. So we've talked about the physical preparation and the building that was required there, but also, even as live action got underway, Howard Hughes' old aircraft plant was taken over. Now, this was reported by Entertainment Weekly at the time, and 750 technicians were working pretty much from July of 1995, knowing they had 9 months to build the visual effects on which Independence Day was going to hinge. Now, running side by side with that, the kind of alien base set that they needed, that alone had taken 4 months to build and put in place. It was a huge amount of just physical real estate they required to house the sets and to house the physical side that they needed, because Devlin had been talking even a year ahead of release about this idea of they needed a spaceship that covered a city. I mean, he was chatting about that as filming kicked off in New York in the summer of 1995. But a year away from release, what would turn into one of the biggest blockbusters of the 1990s, it would be fair to say that no one had heard of it. That if you went up to someone and mentioned the name Independence Day as a film, you just would have been met with shrugs. And in fact, it wasn't until August of 1995 that Independence Day was 100% confirmed as the title as well. Warner Brothers allowed Fox to use it. And as Bill Pullman would relate to Complex as well, they moved the filming of his Independence Day speech forward in the schedule, again as part of this effort just to stop Fox renaming the movie, because Fox had decided on an alternate title. It wanted the film to be called Doomsday. And so at the point Bill Pullman just stood there and filmed his speech, it wasn't 100% certain that the title had been locked, but these were all like little tricks that they were using to slide that into place. Now, the White House, of course, plays a central part in some of the visuals of Independence Day. So the interiors that they were doing there, they were reusing sets that have been used elsewhere. So the same White House set you'll also see in the 1995 romantic comedy, The American President, really underrated film that as well. But also they had to come up with the White House a few different ways as well. Basically, they had to rebuild it. They couldn't film in the White House. They had to use models. They built a White House exterior as well in a Los Angeles car park too. And then there was the 14-foot model of the White House that they built for one particular sequence that would become the absolute centerpiece of the promotion for Independence Day. And it was a 14-foot model that they had one shot to get the explosion of. It was a 1 second explosion that they were capturing. And so to give them as many options as possible when they got to the edit suite, they shot this explosion with 9 cameras. They also shot it at 300 frames per second, which gave them a lot more screen time just to get across the scale of the explosion, and just made it, by slowing it down so much, it also made it look a lot more dramatic. Now, naturally, as this was a Hollywood production, there was a fair amount of KY jelly involved as well. In this case, needed to create the alien goo that you see in the film. And then, as Bill Pullman was talking about, he just said when they were making it, I had real things around me, but at the point they had to look up to the sky, he just said we all looked up at different things for 15 minutes, and we'd say, are you looking at the telephone pole or that little grey thing? What's that grey thing, he'd question. And so as much as there were practical stuff around them, this was also the era coming in where you had to look at a ping pong ball or a reference point, knowing that the visual effects work was going to be put in later on. Now, the 72-day schedule was pretty rigidly kept to, but there was some flexibility required. I mean, there was room for improvisation for a start. I mean, Jeff Goldblum is said to have improvised a fair amount of the dialogue that you hear in the film. But also there was a part of the film where Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum are locked in the cockpit of what is, of course, a model spaceship. And the pair of them were corpsing. They kept losing time because as they were trying to recite the lines and do what they needed to do, they kept getting the giggles, to the point where in the end Emmerich just decided to wrap up for the day and capture all the material they needed for that the day after instead. And in fact, by the end of filming, Will Smith would reflect to Entertainment Weekly that because of the dominance of the effects, both practical and digital in the film, it meant actually he'd done around a third of the filming he would have expected on a movie of this size. Now, even throughout the shoot as well, which concluded in November of 1995, there was still that ongoing eye on Mars attacks. And I've covered Mars attacks in a previous episode of this podcast. That was going through challenges as well. And in the end, its release date would push out of the summer of 1996 towards the back end of that year. And Independence Day had a bit of a run-up, provided it could hit its planned release date, which, as you might expect, was Independence Day in the US. There was no way once they picked the title that they could move away. So the release was actually earmarked for Independence Day weekend. July the 3rd, 1996 was the date. And the film came in at a price of $75 million in the end, but that involved a little extra expense once the movie hit post-production, because, it was 12 hours a day of editing, day after day after day after day. Emmerich locked himself in the edit suite, and at the point they got to January 1996, for instance, so what are we, 6 months ahead of release, only 10% of the effects work was complete. And also Emmerich was spotting the holes in the film, and a reshoot list was coming together too. Now, movie studios have various different relationships with pickup shots and reshoots. Reshoots sometimes are a cause of trouble, but mostly they're part and parcel of the making of a modern blockbuster film. And working in favour of Emmerich and Devlin here was they'd been on time so far, they'd been on schedule, and they'd given Fox precious little problems really. And so getting the reshoot work authorised wasn't going to be a problem. Meanwhile, over in a different office at Fox, there was the marketing campaign that was coming together. Now, this would spectacularly kickstart with a Superbowl commercial, one of the most prime pieces of advertising real estate on US television. And so they duly booked the slot, and they decided they were going to go with the trailer. The trailer that saw the White House blasted, imagery of these massive spaceships over American cities, and just the kind of cinematic visuals that they just hoped would get tongues a-wagging at a point where we weren't in the social media era, we weren't in the World Wide Web era really, certainly not in terms of public use of it, and this was going to require some good old-fashioned word of mouth, and so they knew the trailer needed to make an impact. And as Emmerich said, as it clearly did make an impact, I think old-fashioned effects will never die out because they're simply too good, said the director of Moonfall. He said, we sometimes make a combination of a model, motion control, photograph models for the foreground, and then go digital, CGI in the background. But however they got there, this shot of a White House model exploding in slow motion was absolutely having the desired effect. The conversations began. The film was fairly quickly not known as Independence Day. It was now ID4, and people were taking that up. A belated sequel to the film ID, perhaps. However, not. But all the while that the promotion was running and the anticipation was going, I mean, it was a race to get the film actually completed. So they were showing bits of it. I mean, as Entertainment Weekly reported, they showed, 20th Century Fox showed 8 minutes of completed footage, pretty much all they had ready to go, in February to the owners of cinemas in America. And as Entertainment Weekly wrote, if Independence Day lives up to the 8 thrilling minutes shown to exhibitors, it won't be an impossible mission for the film to be the summer's top grosser. You get a hint there of what the competition was, with Tom Cruise headlining Mission Impossible, a more traditional movie star vehicle perhaps. I love that film as well. And here there was a film that wasn't relying on movie star power really at all, even though by this point Bad Boys had become a hit and Will Smith's big screen career had really kick-started in earnest. Now, the late extra spend was added, and as Devlin said, we're way within budget, but the feeling is we could use more. He said, we learned it's not enough for the good guy to win. The bad guy has to suffer, and we realise we don't have enough of that. And so 20th Century Fox backed the decision to put more of those shots in as well. And as Emmerich said, it's not very expensive to add the shots. It depends how well behaved you were the rest of the shoot. They were well behaved, and also Fox was really getting the impression that it had a major blockbuster on its hands. The film went before critics then, and I mean, the cinematic scale of it quickly appealed. Now, Independence Day had a rollout around the world that was fairly contracted. I mean, now we're used to blockbusters all coming out on the same day everywhere in the world. Certainly less so in the mid-1990s. I mean, in the case of Mars Attacks, for instance, we had to wait months after the US release to get it in the UK. Now, the critics were zeroing in on Independence Day's fairly thin plot, and maybe the characters didn't have an awful lot to them. But the spectacle of it, one of the most iconic scenes of blockbuster cinema of the 1990s, is in Independence Day. And as much as people were happy to drive holes through the plot, not massively tricky, a good copy of Norton Antivirus certainly helps, for instance, the fact was people were talking about it. The word of mouth was growing. People were going to turn up, and 20th Century Fox was going to have a sizable hit on its hands. But how big was it going to be? Well, as it opened that weekend, Fox had a $50 million opening weekend. And I mean, at that point, that was huge money. Now, the competition around on July the 5th to the 7th, 1996, when the numbers were being tallied, John Travolta headlined The Odd Film Phenomenon. That's a really frustrating film, that is. Might talk about that in the future. The Nutty Professor, starring Eddie Murphy, had topped the chart the week before, and Striptease had been out the week before and had not done great guns. But a lot of the serious competition had been giving Independence Day a bit of a wide berth. Mission Impossible, for instance, had come out basically 2 months before and was still in the top 10, but had made a fair amount of money, as had Twister. 2.5 months prior to Independence Day, Twister was around. The Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle Eraser, that was around. It was up to its third week, was already up to $70 million all in. But Independence Day was clearly the film to beat. And as the competition kept coming, Independence Day stuck its place at the top of the charts. Its business dropped only 30% the following week, but within a week on release it was up to over $150 million in the US alone. I mean, the following week it was Courage Under Fire and Harriet the Spy that were trying to knock it off the top slot. The week after, along came the brilliant The Frighteners, along came Fled, along came Multiplicity, along came Kazam. Imagine. There was Independence Day, still doing more than double the money of any other film in the chart. It was only dethroned in the end by a John Grisham adaptation, A Time to Kill, which grossed 14 million on its opening weekend at the end of July. But there was Independence Day still with 13.8 and still holding its own. And as films like Matilda, Chain Reaction, Escape from LA all came to try and knock it off its perch, Independence Day was absolutely resolute in the top 5. In fact, it wouldn't even leave the top 10 until the summer was very much done and dusted. Its total US gross in the end, $306 million. Outside of the US, the universal language of massive special effects blowing stuff up, well, that played everywhere. Another $500 million. And so, Independence Day, $817 million the film grossed by the time it left cinemas in 1996. And, well, it was a massive, massive hit. A massive profitable hit as well. And just to put it into context of 1996, it was the biggest grossing film of the year in the US, comfortably 50-60 million ahead of Twister, even further ahead of Mission Impossible, and nothing really was giving it a lot of competition. Which all led to the inevitable question, is there going to be a sequel? And over time, there were conversations about this. At one point, there were going to be 2 sequels back to back. Various different options were abandoned. I mean, it was going to be ID Forever Part 1 and ID Forever Part 2. And it was only in, 2016 in the end that we got Independence Day Resurgence. But that was a bit of a story in its own right. And I will come to that in a future episode of the podcast. However, for the purposes of this story, as paper thin as Independence Day remains, one of the things by rooting itself so much in practical effects as much as digital is the look of it really, really, really stands up. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Just a few parish notices for you, and then I'll get on with the second film. Firstly, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are 3 ways in particular you can do so, all very much appreciated. If you go to Patreon and put some money in the tin there, go to patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get the podcast ad-free, you get it early, you find out gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well, and there's quite a lot of stuff coming over the coming months to tell you about. Costing you absolutely nothing is just subscribe at your podcast home of choice. That's hugely helpful to us, much appreciated. Also, ideally leaving a hugely positive review. That, for independent podcasts like this, real gold dust and much appreciated. We're also putting the finishing touches to 2 new magazines, Film Stories issue 43 and Film Junior's latest issue is nearly done as well. I hope to have more news on both of those in the next episode of the podcast. And if you want to hear me waffle in person as well, I am back in London on June the 1st, 2023 for my Movie Geek live show. I'm delighted to say I'll be joined by special guest Sarah Smith, the director of Arthur Christmas and Ron's Gone Wrong, and the co-founder of Locksmith Animation as well. You can find details of all upcoming Film Stories live events. If you go to filmstories.co.uk, click on the live events tab, that's where you can find all you need, and ticket link as well. But without further ado, I'm going to stick with blockbusters for the second of the 2 films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. This one wasn't as successful, but the story behind it was, well, an interesting one. Let's just put it that way. I'll set this up with a clip from the film's trailer. We'll come to the story the other side of this.
You ready for this?
I'm going to walk up to him, look him right in the eyes.
What are you gonna say?
Your daughter is the best thing that has happened to me in my entire life. It would be an honor to have your permission to marry her.
What is wrong with you?
You went from enlisted to an officer faster than anyone in the history of the United States Navy.
But I have never, ever seen a man waste himself better than you. What my daughter sees in you is a great mystery to me. Enjoy these naval exercises, Hopper. They're likely to be your last.
And that was a clip from 2012's Battleship, directed by Peter Berg, written by John and Eric Heber, based on the board game Battleship, published by Hasbro, coming to them shortly. Taylor Kitsch, Alexander Skarsgård, Rihanna, Brooklyn Decker and Liam Neeson form the core cast of the film. And we're going to start this story fairly appropriately with a press release, because this was a film manufactured out of corporate product, really. And the press release was issued on the 20th of February 2008, and I found it still lurking on the Hasbro website. And it says, Universal Pictures and Hasbro signed strategic partnership. And they announced today that they formed a 6-year strategic partnership to produce at least 4 motion pictures based on some of the world's best known and beloved brands, including Monopoly, Candyland, Clue, Ouija, Battleship, Magic the Gathering and Stretch Armstrong. Now, interestingly, already I can tell you that most of those, well, the good chunk of those projects ended up somewhere else as well. However, under the terms of the deal, it wrote, Hasbro will partner exclusively with Universal Pictures for feature films, with the exception of Transformers, which became the centrepiece of the 2007 smash hit movie directed by Michael Bay, and G.I. Joe, which is currently filming under the direction of Stephen Sommers. The first movie from this deal will be released in 2010 or 2011, and Universal will release at least one film a year thereafter. Well, the first movie from the deal wasn't released in 2010 or 2011, but not for the want of trying. And this was part of Hollywood studios searching far and wide for material that could basically fuel big franchise movies. That was the way Hollywood was going. Big blockbusters, ideally based on something pre-existing. And, well, people looked at Disney, which at this point had got, 3 or 4 movies out of a theme park ride with Pirates of the Caribbean, for instance. And so Universal thought this was quite wise. Now, Hasbro would go on to buy its own movie studio, Entertainment One, which at the time of this recording, it's trying to sell most of as well. But it was partnering with Universal here, and thus Ridley Scott was linked with a movie of Monopoly, for instance. A Ouija board was handed to Michael Bay's production company, Platinum Dunes, although that iteration would ultimately be abandoned and it would resurface a few years later. Candyland was going to be a hugely expensive film. Adam Sandler was going to star in that. The price of it was said to be around $200 million. And Kevin Lima, the director of Enchanted, was hired to helm the Candyland movie. But it was Battleship that was the one that was bubbling to the top at a point where Universal was looking for franchises. It didn't just want one film, it wanted more than one. And so this seemed to be the fastest track to building an audience for something new. And so it moved relatively quickly. The deal was struck with Hasbro in February 2008. And by May 2009, it became clear that the Battleship film was the frontrunner. More to the point, had a director as well. Peter Berg was hired to helm the film, and it was also confirmed in May 2009 that screenwriters had been sought. John and Eric Heber, they'd signed on the dotted line to write the script. At that stage, they had the thriller Whiteout to their name, starring Kate Beckinsale. They'd also just written Red, which was going through the motions of coming together. At the point the Battleship deal was signed, Bruce Willis was circling the idea of starring with Red, which he ultimately would. But the Hebers had an idea, and it was take the basics of Battleship, a game about sinking boats in the sea, ultimately, and add an alien invasion into the middle of it with the board game sort of as inspiration. You'd be able to sell loads of toys around that, right? Nothing could possibly go wrong. Now, happening in the background of all of this were changes at NBC Universal, the parent company, and a couple of things. First of all, the studio just hadn't been able to buy a hit, and boy had it been trying. It's interesting that it's films that it had lined up for 2012 in the end, including Snow White and the Huntsman, the idea of tapping into classic fairy stories. It had just borrowed that idea off Disney, which had enjoyed a massive success with the 2010 live-action Alice in Wonderland, and even Battleship was kind of a little bit out the Pirates of the Caribbean playbook. Its biggest hit had been the Despicable Me film, the first one, but even that had come as part of a partnership with the new animation studio, Illumination, that was set up in France. And so a live action hit, that was trickier at a point where others were having a bit more joy with it. And so in October 2009, enter stage left a brand new studio chairman at NBC Universal, a man called Adam Fogelson. And he was, one of the first decisions on his desk was, what on earth do you do with Battleship? because even in pre-production, this one was troublesome. It was causing issues. It had been budgeted at $150 million, but already the signs were it might just cost a bit more than that. And one of the first decisions that Fogelson had to make as he settled into his new office was basically, do you stick or twist? It's not unusual that when a new chair of a studio comes in, they just go over the entire slate of upcoming films, decide which ones to back, and if they should put any into turnaround, posh word for junking them. If Fogelson had said no to Battleship at that point, Universal would have faced a $30 million write-off just to can the film. So it was knee-deep in this one way or another. If it pressed ahead, well, the thinking was that the worst, the losses wouldn't be that bad, and it'd get a film at the end. So Fogelson gambled. The film got the green light. And there was still a couple of changes. That in 2010, for instance, the movie was set to shoot in Australia. In fact, they'd settled on locations around the Gold Coast area of Australia. But tax incentive problems kicked in. The Australian government's incentive pot was not conducive enough to get Universal to sign up there, and so it decided to relocate shooting to Hawaii. America, a bit more expensive place to shoot the film, but without the tax rebates, it just seemed like a simpler deal, and all the while the budget was continuing to go north. But at least if they had locations and they had a script and they had a director, then the casting could move forward. And the top candidate at first to take on the lead role in Battleship was none other than, well, Jeremy Renner, as it happened. Now, this was Jeremy Renner before he became full-on movie star Jeremy Renner. In fact, The Bourne Legacy, the film that really just kind of groomed him for a leading role in a franchise, would land in 2012, ironically enough. But at this point, he'd come to the top of many studios' casting lists as the male lead in The Hurt Locker, which went on to win Best Picture. Marvel had also picked him up and cast him as a supporting character, Hawkeye, in its cinematic universe of films. That had done him no harm at all. But Renner had a choice to make at this stage. Do you take the lead in a major Universal blockbuster, Battleship, or do you sign up for the new Paul Thomas Anderson film? And Paul Thomas Anderson was reportedly interested in Renner taking one of the lead roles in that. And so Renner was veering towards that Paul Thomas Anderson project that would become The Master. But in the end, oddly enough, he wouldn't sign on the dotted line for either of these films. He passed on Battleship, and when it came to casting The Master, in the end, Paul Thomas Anderson, for reasons I don't quite know, went with Joaquin Phoenix instead of Jeremy Renner. Meanwhile, the Battleship team was already looking towards another fast-rising Hollywood star, Taylor Kitsch, who had been attached already to the title role of the film that was then known as John Carter of Mars for Disney, and that was being eyed as a potential trilogy, as I'll explore in a future episode. But Taylor Kitsch had come to prominence off the back of the TV show Friday Night Lights. The film of Friday Night Lights was directed by Peter Berg as well, and Kitsch's casting, a bit of a coup really, was announced in April 2010. And as the Hollywood Reporter noted in its report, Kitsch's casting is in fact in line with the recent trend of putting up-and-comers at the centre of tentpole picks. And the examples it cited were Garrett Hedlund in Tron Legacy and Chris Evans in Captain America. I wonder what happened to Chris Evans. Now, the pre-production was building up, and 2 months before the start of filming, Peter Berg took a surprise phone call, and he revealed this in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. And he said, I was in my office one day and I get a call, and someone just says, Kevin Costner's on the phone. Now, Berg hadn't met Costner, but he was just like, hello, and he's just like, I need to come in and talk to you. And so it was like, when do you want to come in? Come in tomorrow. Okay. Now, the backdrop of this is the last major blockbuster outside of the Pirates of the Caribbean films to be set at sea was Waterworld, starring Kevin Costner. We can throw Master and Commander in there as well, which I've covered on a previous episode of the podcast. But Universal had backed Waterworld. Waterworld had been a very tricky project. And so, out of the blue, Costner had sought Peter Berg out just to pass on some tips. And Costner was reported as saying, in Berg's words, I feel compelled to talk to you and I want to tell you the stuff we did right and the stuff we did wrong. And the pair of them talked for 3 hours with Costner telling stories about the perils of filming on the ocean. He took them through the logistics of filming and the fundamentals of making sure that the crew were okay. Berg appreciated this and talked about it a couple of times ahead of the release of Battleship. But it was one of the few positive stories, really, because even heading towards production, the Hollywood trade press was sharpening its pencils a little bit. And so just 2 weeks before filming was going to begin in August of 2010, the Hollywood Reporter ran a big piece about why they're spending $200 million on a board game movie. This isn't Pirates of the Caribbean, they argued. And Adam Fogelson came out and batted for the film. He said it's a big bet, like many, many big bets from many studios. He said we'll be nowhere near the high point and nowhere near the low point of what people are spending. But just a month or two before he'd come to the decision of moving forward with Battleship, Universal had actually pulled the plug on a different project. So, the fingers were over the buttons. And it was the movie Sicario that Universal backed away from. Ultimately ended up as a hit for Lionsgate. And it was 5 weeks before filming that Sicario got pulled by Universal. And so, understandably, there were a little bit of, will Universal do the same thing for Battleship? But this was too big a deal. This was too big a ship to stop, as it happened. And so, even by this stage as well, I mean, they scored a casting coup. Rihanna had agreed to come on board and make her feature film debut. At this stage, Peter Berger got the idea to cast her as a result of a press conference, an interview she gave when matters of her private life came to the fore, and he just thought, well, there's a performance in there that she could give in the film, and so got in touch, and she agreed to sign up. And then there was plans put in place now that there wouldn't actually be a lot of filming on water. This is mainly going to be CG, a lot of soundstage work. They'll shoot for just under a week actually on physical water. All the while, in the background, more corporate shenanigans, because Comcast was in the final stretches of acquiring NBC Universal, that the company was going to have a new parent. And also, just as filming was about to begin, the pressure on the Universal movie team was intensified when Edgar Wright's terrific Scott Pilgrim vs. the World arrived at a cost anywhere between $60 to $90 million and really struggled at the box office. Universal was desperately looking for a live-action hit, and again, it had failed to line one up. So, Battleship originally was being primed for a 2011 release, but it would decide to move the film to April 2012. But whether it knew it or not, the threat of superheroes was coming on the horizon. The shoot of Battleship, not much drama in the stories of that, began in August 2010. And it would film for several months, and it would be located in the US. I think there's one little bit that they go to China for, which was part of the cause really in early 2010s Hollywood, trying to lure Chinese cinemas to show their films just for a start. And one of the ways to grease those particular wheels was to, just have a Chinese character brought in or shoot sequences in China. I mean, the most cynical way this was done was in Marvel's Iron Man 3. It's a fairly famous story where a single scene was shot specifically for the Chinese audience, which guaranteed in the end the film a Chinese release, which proved very, very lucrative. But it's a really odd scene that you can dig out on YouTube. For Battleship, this was a big, huge production, and they did get some military cooperation, unlike Independence Day. But then Battleship didn't mention Area 51. It did get use of the USS Missouri, a bit of a coup that they got a genuine naval vessel with genuine naval personnel on board as well, and it meant taking the ship out of commission for a day as well. The whole thing was a big scale production, a huge amount of visual effects and hundreds of extras brought in as well, and lots of filming in America, the budget continuing to go up. And by the end, even as a deal with Activision for a tie-in video game was announced, the video game would never happen, the budget was said to be escalating to $220 million. Still, by the end of 2010, the physical filming on Battleship was complete, but there was going to be a lot of post-production work. There was a lot of visual effects required, but Peter Berg and his team had over a year to find the final cut. How Universal was going big on it. It was pushing the film, positioning it as a blockbuster for 2012. So there was the attendance at San Diego Comic-Con, for instance, showcasing footage there. The first trailer arriving in July 2011 and trying to just whip up enthusiasm for the movie, which it didn't really do. Universal bet on a Superbowl commercial early 2012, and again, it got the name of the film out there, but there was still a bit of, wait, isn't that the board game? Why are they making a film based on a board game? And the ink was continuing to be put on pages, suggesting that this was one of the biggest risks of the summer. And again, Fogelson came out to bat for the film. I mean, he was bullish in the weeks leading up to the movie's release. He was confident that in his passionate director, in the cast, in the audience. He argued that worldwide more people have played Battleship than played with Transformers, although crucially Battleship's characters don't transform into killer robots, and so maybe that was a slight flaw in the thinking. Also, Universal was perhaps just sensing that things weren't going entirely to plan. It played with the release schedule a little bit. And so the release of Battleship was staggered around the world, unusual by the early 2010s. However, there were some problems on the horizon. There was a major football tournament, international football tournament in 2012. And so that would turn out to be one reason why the European release was affected, because the Euro 2012 competition was going to take people's attention. There was an Olympic Games in the summer as well. And all of this was competition for big movies, and Universal wanted to give its biggest bet of the year as much space as possible to make a landing. There was also the fact that, the world was becoming aware that Marvel's Avengers crossover movie that was coming, the 2012 one directed by Joss Whedon, was tracking with exceptional numbers and was now regarded as one of the big films to beat in that summer. Now, whether it was by design or whether it was because of coincidence, because of the sporting activities going on, what this meant was Battleship was going to come out in Europe before it hit America. Again, hugely unusual, particularly now, for a major blockbuster movie, not least one costing the amount of money that this was. And so the first release of the film was actually in Tokyo in April of 2012. It wouldn't make it to the US until the middle of May 2012. The reviewers, they just weren't keen. I mean, there's no real way to butter this up. It wasn't absolutely slammed, and some of the sequences, there was a bit of praise in there, but also there was a kind of, well, what's the point? The characters weren't quite working out. The plot was all right. I mean, the set pieces were pretty good. The dialogue not too great. But also, I think a lot of people never got over the idea of the concept of it. Why on earth is a big blockbuster film being made about Battleship? And unfortunately, the story of the film made it a tricky one to justify as well. I mean, it's really hard to answer that question because they didn't really find a story to lift it, I would suggest. However, it would be remiss to say that Battleship flopped. It's frequently regarded as a flop, but in Europe, I mean, it snared over $200 million. And so most of that came before the movie had hit American cinemas. That Universal had, I mean, it hadn't covered the cost of the film by any measure at that point, but it had a couple of $100 million in the bank by the time it was able to put this out in America. And, well, it was grateful to do so because the Avengers had come out two weeks before and was already on its way to nearly $500 million inside 3 weeks, actually, inside 3 weeks in US cinemas. Battleship opened in second place with $25 million. In third, I mean, there was competition as well. In third place was The Dictator, starring Sacha Baron Cohen, $17 million on its opening weekend. That the Avengers was hoovering up the audience. Of real worry to Universal as well, the Avengers was hoovering up a repeat audience. People were going back several times to see the film. You'd go on social media and just say, oh, I'm going in for round 2, for round 3. So Battleship's second weekend was down to 11 million, and Universal knew it was, for want of a better way of putting it, sunk at the US. Men in Black 3 came out while it's on its second week of release. I mean, that was a troubled project as well, but 55 million it managed to gross, a hefty amount more than the hugely disappointing returns for Battleship. Universal's Snow White and the Huntsman popped up at the start of June. That did better. That put 56 million in the coffers, but you go down the chart, you scroll down the chart, and Battleship started to plummet as the competition really ramped up. By the time it had left American cinemas, Battleship was marked as a firm disappointment. Just 65 million in the States, offset by 237 million outside of America. Total gross 300 million, and already the Universal Hasbro deal was in trouble. The Candyland film was gone. Ridley Scott decided not to make Monopoly. Ouija ended up elsewhere. And the Hollywood Reporter, which had been keen to write the obituary before the film, was now writing it again afterwards. It penned an article going on about it that several top industry insiders think they can skip looking for answers as to why it didn't work, because so many saw peril in making a 210 million plus budget film based on a board game from the start. It quoted a leading agent as saying nobody here thought Battleship was worth the investment, no stars, an intellectual property play that made no sense, and nobody thought that the script was good. Universal, meanwhile, was pumping 9 figures into the Keanu Reeves film 47 Ronin. It had big hopes for the Bourne Legacy as well, and it would start to recover its mojo a little bit at the box office over time, but it was still, well, disappointed by the returns, the commercial returns of the Battleship film. I mean, Adam Fogelson would stick by the film and would continue to stick also by its director, Peter Berg, and Fogelson not long afterwards would decamp to STX, and he would leave Universal, and when he was at STX he sent the script to Peter Berg for the film Mile 22, which he would go on to make in 2018. And there was one little bright spot for Universal, at least, that Battleship turned into a good DVD and Blu-ray seller when it landed on the format in the autumn of 2012. It was still a long way away from meeting the commercial expectations that it had when it greenlit the picture, but like many of the times we discuss a film that perceived to have failed at the box office, Battleship wasn't quite the massive loss maker that it was perhaps reported as, but still, it was a bit of an odd choice for a $200 million blockbuster movie, and I don't think it ever really got over that. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you could get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. There's more on the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories online, youtube.com/Film Stories. Our website is filmstories.co.uk, and that's updated every weekday with news, reviews, features and things like that. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find all of our print magazines for sale, as well as our sneakers Blu-ray that we've made here in the UK. And the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. But I think I've bored you enough. As always, I thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Hit. You have sunk my battleship.